Dear all, it's a pleasure for me to welcome you on behalf of the Fundación Bertelsmann here in the Espacio Bertelsmann to present the study on the role of the European Union in the new geopolitical reality we're living in. And as you know, this study has been elaborated by our colleagues from the Bertelsmann Stiftung and also by the Vienna Institute of Economic Studies. Thank you very much, Christian, Miriam, Richard, for this piece of work, which is not only very interesting, but also comes very timely. I would also like to thank our colleagues from the Real Instituto Elcano, Mira Milosevic, Haitham Amira, and Miguel Otero, and also our colleague from the European Commission, Maciej Berestecki, for having accepted to participate in this event. And of course, I could not be happier to see such a big and varied audience here, from people from different embassies to members of the Spanish government and of regional governments, of think tank experts, policy makers and policy thinkers, university professors, students of political science, journalists. So summing up, there are many different sectors of the society here, and this shows on one side that there is a great interest in the topic, and on the other side that there is a lot of expectation in this event due to the huge prestige both of the institutions and the experts that are here today. So thank you again for accompanying us here in Madrid in the Espacio Bertelsmann. And the truth is that no one would have imagined 1.5 years ago that we would have another long war in Europe, a war that has brought with it the largest forced displacement crisis in the recent years in Europe, and which of course has a lot of economic, social and political consequences. The study, which we are going to see today, points out on one side that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has marked the start of a new geopolitical and geo-economic area, and that other major players have had to take position in this situation, like the United States and China. Your study, Richard, Miriam, Christian, comes at a very good moment to analyze the role that the European Union should have in front of their neighbor, of the immediate neighbors in the south and in the east. And it also contains some very valuable recommendations. And I think you all will agree with me that the title of this event, Keeping Friends Closer, summarizes very well these recommendations. I'm very sure that this event and the debate that will follow will be highly stimulating for all of us. So let's enjoy the event. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Clara. Thanks a lot, Clara. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Maciej Berestecki, the Press and Policy Officer from the European Commission, who will give a short presentation about the EU's neighborhood policy. Maciej, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you to the Bertelsmann Foundation for inviting the European Commission to the presentation of the study that is looking into how to improve the effectiveness of the EU enlargement policy in the new geopolitical context. My name is Maciej Berestecki. I'm a policy officer and one of the spokespersons of the European Commission here in Spain. And I would like to say a few words as a way of introduction about the EU enlargement policy. EU neighborhood policy and the EU enlargement policy, actually. So the EU neighborhood policy governs the relationship of the EU with around 14 neighboring countries. And actually, when we speak about neighborhood policy, we should also consider the enlargement policy. As we spoke with Christian before the event, enlargement policy can actually be considered also a neighboring policy. So when you consider enlargement policy, of course, you extend the number of countries to quite a few more in the east of Europe, in the south of Europe as well. I'm speaking here mostly about Western Balkans, about Ukraine, about Moldova. The countries who aspire to become EU members, some of them already have an EU candidate status, others will have it in the future. So the European Neighborhood Policy was launched actually in 2004, when the big enlargement happened, when my country also accessed the EU, Poland. And actually the first objective was to avoid a sort of dividing line between the new enlarged Europe and the neighboring countries in terms of economic development, in terms of prosperity. So the idea was to actually strengthen the prosperity of the whole region, including the neighboring countries. And the European Neighborhood Policy builds on the commitment of both the EU and the neighboring countries to a set of principles. And these principles are promotion of democracy, rule of law, respect for human rights, social cohesion. But when we revised the European Neighborhood Policy in 2015, we added to this short list another 3 priorities which are equally important or even more important today. And they are economic development for stability, for stabilization of the region. They are security, but also migration and mobility, so important in Spain. The European Neighborhood Policy is based very much on the bilateral cooperation. So it is the relationship between the EU and each individual country, and it's actually framed in what we call joint documents. So they can be partnership priorities or association agendas, so high-level documents which we agree with individual countries and in which we include priorities and political and economic priorities for cooperation and reforms. So what is guiding principle of the European Neighborhood Policy is actually a differentiation, because we approach each country in our neighborhood in an individual manner. We try to establish very tailor-made partnership with these countries in order to respond to different aspirations, because these countries may have different aspirations in terms of relationship with the EU. But beyond the support to or bilateral cooperation, we also very much invest in the development of their own regional cooperation. So when we speak about Western Balkans or Eastern Partnership, we also support and very much stimulate their own internal regional cooperation. For instance, in the area of energy, which is currently so essential. So the EU support to neighboring countries is aimed to contribute to the stability through economic development principally. It is through open markets, trade, sustainable growth, but also inclusive economic development, and what is also important, prospects for young people. When you consider neighborhood policy, you will look at countries in Northern Africa. You will look at the problem of migration, illegal migration. So in order to prevent these from happening, we want young people to have a prospect to stay within their countries and develop and grow professionally. So we do invest in the neighborhood policy through different instruments, not only a political dialogue, but also a number of other tools and financial support, such as grants, investments, but also technical assistance or budgetary guarantees. Thanks to the quite an innovative financial architecture, we managed to crowd in private investors too in neighborhood policy, in cooperation with EU financial institutions such as the European Investment Bank or European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It is also essential for the EU in the context of the neighborhood policy to invest and develop green and digital transition of the neighboring countries in line with the EU policy principles. So in this regard, we do support these countries in fulfilling their targets and contributions to the Paris Agreement. And as an example, I can mention the close cooperation that the EU launched with Morocco on their green transition and sustainable agriculture, for instance. The European neighborhood policy also gives, obviously, a strong support, and recently even more, to energy cooperation. This is important both from the security and renewable energies point of view. So both these elements of the energy cooperation we strongly support in the context of the neighborhood policy. And another example that I can give is a landmark agreement that the EU signed with Egypt and Israel on energy cooperation recently. When it comes to digital transition, I can mention a project that we are supporting financially, which is a submarine cable that is connecting the EU with North Africa. As I mentioned, migration is another key element of the European neighborhood policy, and I don't have to explain why here in Spain. What we do when it comes to migration, we concentrate on actions which address root causes of migration. So we strengthen border control, crack down on organized crime and smugglers. So in practical terms, for instance, we deliver life-saving equipment for border management. However, and as I mentioned at the beginning, in the context of the neighborhood policy, we should not forget about the enlargement process. Enlargement process is considered to be the most effective EU foreign policy instrument. It's a strategic investment for the EU because it brings stability and prosperity on the European continent and at the EU borders. I don't have to explain more, being from Poland and coming back from the region which is neighboring to Ukraine. So this is indeed a very important policy objective to invest in enlargement and including in new candidate states such as Ukraine or Moldova. Actually, the present situation and the invasion of Russia in Ukraine has strengthened the EU neighborhood policy and has accelerated the enlargement process. So the invasion of Russia has actually brought the EU and its neighbor countries closer together. In this context, I would like to mention the EU membership negotiations that we launched with Albania and North Macedonia last July. And in October, we recommended to grant candidate status to Bosnia and Herzegovina. Obviously, in the meantime, and as you all know, Ukraine and Moldova received their candidate status to the EU, and Georgia was offered a European perspective. This shows that we are only deepening the level of our relationships with neighboring and enlargement countries. And to give another example, EU has fully integrated the Western Balkans into its food and energy security initiatives in the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The region has also been invited to participate in the EU joint gas purchases that we launched only last month. What is more, the energy community, the European Union in the energy community is also opening electricity market to Western Balkans and Eastern candidates. And the Repower EU policy, which is a new energy policy of the EU, is helping to reduce the Western Balkans dependence on Russian gas. And last but not least, we obviously continue supporting Ukraine and its citizens through macro-financial assistance and budget support operations, and our commitment to help with all the means the reconstruction of the country. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon to everyone. Buenas tardes. Schönen Nachmittag. My name is Miguel Otero. I'm senior analyst at Elcano Royal Institute, and I have the pleasure to moderate this session. We have the privilege to have three of the authors of this report here. We'll start with Miriam Cosmel, who is a senior expert with the Bertelsmann Stiftung and spent considerable time as well in Eastern Europe. She worked in Ukraine for 5 years or 4 years between 2012 and 2018. During the 2014 events, in 10 years as well in Russia before that. And we'll have then the presentation by Richard of the report, Richard Griveson, who is Deputy Director at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, an economist by training, expert in Central, East and Southeastern Europe, with a particular focus on Turkey. He was just telling me that he has quite a lot of media work these days, given that Turkey has elections in a few days. And after that, we'll have a roundtable of the two authors just mentioned. The other author that is with us, Christian Hanelt, who is expert in the EU's neighborhood policy in the South and Middle East, also with the Bertelsmann Stiftung, and who has studied in Germany, but as well in Syria. And will be joined by our my two colleagues from Elcano Institute, Mira Milosevic, expert in Eastern Europe, and Amira Fernandez, expert in Northern Africa and the Middle East. So we'll start, as I said, with Miriam shortly for the setting of the study, and then we would move to Richard.
Thank you very much, Miguel. I'm not here alone, as Miguel said, but with Christian Hanelt, my colleague working on the EU Neighborhood South, and also with our team leader, who is here in the audience, Stephanie Weiss. And we are actually thrilled to be able to do what is always the most nice part of doing a study, to discuss it with those that are the recipients. So we very much look forward to this debate with you after Richard's presentation. I'll just do a very brief scene setter. Christian and Stephanie and I, we have worked on neighborhood issues a lot. Christian and Stephanie on Turkey, Western Balkans, I myself on the Eastern Partnership countries. In previous studies, we examined competitive geopolitical ambitions in the EU neighborhood and explored opportunities of action for the European Union, especially vis-à-vis Russia's strategic patterns of action, its political, military, economic pressure on the EU neighbors who themselves often were too weak to resist. Now, since 2019, the buzzword of a geopolitical European Commission has been on everybody's lips when standing up for the EU's interests in an increasingly competitive world has been discussed. And it was clear at the same time that the EU's economic power was in focus and traditional foreign policy pushed aside. Aiming to contribute to the de facto geo-economic European Commission, we teamed up with the Vienna Institute for International Economic Study that Richard Griveson presents here, and set out to measure the EU's and its neighbors' interdependencies in 5 key areas. The traditional ones, trade and finance, and in addition, technology and know-how, infrastructure, and labor mobility. Now, we used the EU neighborhood as a starting point because one of our theses is that if the EU wants to strengthen its global weight, it must succeed in its neighborhood first. For our study, Keeping Friends Closer, a very large team worked with large amounts of data covering the period between 2007 until 2021. Richard will go into this in more detail. Now, expectedly, we came up with ample evidence of a great degree of interdependence that might be used positively. We also show that Russia is rarely a rival in economic terms, but at the same time, China's role has been remarkably growing, and we go into detail how and where. Now, with Russia's all-out war against Ukraine since February 2022, and in and against Ukraine directly, but also against the European Union as a successful peace project. And that has been mentioned already by the previous speakers. Global rivalries have been on the rise as a consequence, and as a result, the EU's ability to wisely manage interdependencies while engaging friends turned out to be critical. Alongside the primacy of security, that is, however, not part of our study. So, moreover, and these are my last points before I hand over to Richard, the EU neighborhood regions are key trade, transport, communication, energy routes. That has been mentioned too. And finally, interdependence is also very relevant for the revived enlargement debate. Richard, I'll hand over to you to present the core results of our study, and I'm very much looking forward to the debate with you all afterwards.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you also to our Spanish colleagues for the invitation to be here. It's really a great pleasure. Arriving from Vienna this morning, I felt like I was going from winter to summer in about 3 hours, and so I started in an especially good mood after enjoying the sun today. As Miriam said, the study was done by a lot of people. I'm presenting on behalf of Bertelsmann Stiftung, on behalf of my institute, the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, and probably about 15 colleagues in total who worked on that. And that's also my excuse in case I cannot answer all of the questions. So I will talk for 15 minutes, 20 minutes maximum, and just give the overview of the study, the main conclusions that we have. It's a big study, there's lots of detail. I cannot go into all of it now, but we can discuss whatever is interesting in the question and answer round. So we start with this proposition. Miriam already outlined it. Geopolitical competition in the EU neighborhood has increased a lot, not only because of the invasion of Ukraine. Actually, we started the study before that, but of course it's intensified it a lot. And the EU has not always been able to best react to that. And so what we wanted to do is, well, we start with the proposition the EU has to be able to react to it better, to live up to its geopolitical ambitions. But we wanted to look really in a deep quantitative sense, what levers does the EU have? How does it use them at the moment? And how can it use them better to achieve political ends in this region? Now, you will have noticed, I'm sure our colleague from the Commission will have noticed, there's more than the neighborhood on here. So when we talk about neighborhood, we are talking about the Eastern Partnership and the Southern neighborhood, but also the Western Balkans and Turkey, because this question of economic competition, geo-economic competition, it's maybe even more relevant actually in the Western Balkans, and so we wanted to make sure to include that as well. So our approach, people get a bit uncomfortable when they see a methodology slide, but I promise there's only one. I'm not going to give you any econometrics at all in this presentation. Just to tell you briefly what we did. So we wanted to quantify EU interconnectivity in the region with, compare it with the US, Russia, and China. They are the peers and the rivals of the EU. No other country has that kind of level of influence. Time period we did from 2007. The reason for that, we had the hypothesis that 2008 was really an inflection point, not only in a financial sense, but in a broader sense, and that was borne out, and I'll mention some examples of that as I go through. Miriam mentioned the areas. We looked at 65 indicators, 5 areas. We did the classic economic interconnectivity indicators, goods, services, finance, but the literature moves on. People start to think about interconnectivity in other ways as well, and we wanted to make sure to include that. So technology, knowledge exchange, infrastructure, and also labor mobility. At the end, then, we have some fields of action, policy. I'll present that very briefly at the end in a broad sense, but I'm sure we'll discuss that more in the questions, what the EU can and should do to improve its leverage. So starting with trade, the classic indicator of connectivity, this just shows all the countries that we looked at, their exports, where do they go as a share of the total. Blue is the EU. You can see the EU is dominant pretty much everywhere. No surprise about that, but I think the extent of the dominance is pretty striking. So there are countries here where 3/4 of all their external trade is with the EU. Many countries have a higher level of connectivity with the EU in trade than many EU member states do. I mean, in this term, these are EU member states already. couple of counterpoints. I mean, there's a bit of red at the top, that's Russia in the Eastern Partnership. You would expect that. A bit of green at the bottom in the southern neighborhood where the US is not insignificant. But basically, this is a story of EU dominance. I think it's well known, but a big reason for this is that the EU has been much more ambitious in its trade agreements than any of the other peers that we looked at. And this is the clear result of that. The problem, the but is, and this is where we think the EU is not maximizing the leverage it has, it's leaving something on the table, is that the trade agreements as they are, the trade integration as it is, it leaves the countries, and here we show only the most integrated, so the countries that either have DCFTAs or SAAs, after many, many years, with the one exception of North Macedonia, many years after year zero, the year of signing the agreement, with very big trade deficits. And this is a big difference to Poland, for example, or any of the EU CEE countries, where many started with big deficits, but it went away over time. And our contention in the study, and we look at a number of different things, is that it's partly in the nature of the trade agreements themselves. So, I mean, we see right at the moment in the case of Ukraine why agriculture is a problem in trade agreements. We see the political impact of that in certain Central and Eastern European EU member states, but also because these countries are subject to the huge agglomeration effects that any country involved in EU integration is subject to, but they don't get everything that goes in the other direction that the EU member states of Central and Eastern Europe get. They don't get the same kind of quality and amount of FDI, which helps to build a better export sector which can close these trade deficits. They don't get the EU budget transfers and other things as well. I'll go into that in a bit more detail. But the point is here, the integration model doesn't deliver in the same way as it has for the EU member states of Central and Eastern Europe. And that's part of why it's been so hard to enforce reform progress in a lot of these countries, foreign policy alignment and other things as well. What we then propose, trade fields of action, a fairer, deeper and more sustainable integration. Easier said than done. We see right now how politically difficult that is. More access to the EU market would certainly help, but also helping neighbors to maximize the access. I mean, pure free trade is going to wipe out a lot of companies in these countries. They need help also to meet the terms, meet the standards of full access to the EU market. And they need a better kind of FDI, and they need more budget transfers. And these have been very important in the past, in the 2004 joiners to help to close these deficits. Partnership approach on standard setting and regulation, taking into account how difficult it is for a lot of these countries to meet EU standards, incentivizing the private sector to nearshore production. I mean, there's a lot going on already. The crowding in of private capital was mentioned at the start, but this is a very particular moment now as supply chains are in flux, as lots of companies are reconsidering where they invest. It's a big opportunity for the neighborhood. It is closer, much closer to Germany and other big sources of FDI, but the EU can certainly help to push that process along. And in return, enforcing the highest standards. So the whole big recommendation I think that we have is that there needs to be a bigger carrot, or there could be a bigger carrot, and in return for that we can get more. You know, the carrot hasn't been big enough to incentivize what we want to see in a lot of these countries. If the carrot is bigger, if the offering is bigger, we can also get more in return. So that was trade. For finance, it's a very similar story. The EU is dominant, the EU is the big player, but it leaves quite a lot on the table. It could do more to enforce its interest, to use the huge influence that it has. This is one example, which is EU budget transfers. I already mentioned it on the previous slide. Even the Western Balkan countries, which are in the turquoise color here above, have had much less from the EU budget as a share of their very small GDP than the EU member states of Central and Eastern Europe. And when you look cumulatively over the last 20 years or so, that's more or less what you see here. It's a huge difference. And we looked at this in this study. We've looked at it in previous studies with the Bertelsmann Stiftung as well. And these budget transfers are an enormous driver of the economic integration that we haven't seen enough of out in the non-EU member states. And especially in the Western Balkan case, to up those levels to a Hungary or a Lithuania level would barely make a dent in the EU budget. It would barely be noticeable. Of course, Ukraine is a different matter. I'm sure we get to that in the debate, but at least in this case, the countries that are closest to the EU at the moment, they could benefit from a lot more of the EU budget, and it would not cost the EU very much to do. What we also looked at finance, and this is obviously a huge topic in geoeconomics, is the role of the euro. And we find, especially when we combine it with the dollar, so the blue here is euro, the green is the dollar, share in foreign currency reserves of the neighborhood countries. The collective West, let's say, is overwhelmingly dominant. I mean, we live in a multipolar world, that's clear. We have huge competition from China, lots of that in this study, but in finance, we're still basically a unipolar world if we take the West as a collective. And especially then if you add Switzerland to this, I mean, it more or less completes the circles. So we've seen the EU has been willing to use this in the case of Russia, financial sanctions in a much stronger way. But otherwise, the EU tends to be quite reticent to use the power of the euro. The US is very willing to do it. The US does it all the time. But that's another thing to be thought about to enforce interest and use geoeconomic levers that the EU has. So fields of action for finance, making more of the undoubted financial strength that the EU has in its neighborhood. More budget transfers for countries that are willing to do the reforms to get them, especially for candidate countries. Funding connectivity and growth-enhancing projects. More that happens already, but can happen more. Focus, of course, on energy, circular economy, digital infrastructure, areas where a lot of the neighborhood is lagging behind. Again, making it easier to access the private capital. Again, back to nearshoring. This is a very particular moment to push that. It's a big opportunity. Again, tying it to conditionality, so the greater offering comes with more demands and more reforms, hopefully, from our side. And then strengthening the euro as a reserve currency and working with the US to use this huge collective leverage that we have. The third topic is then technology knowledge exchange. And here the story gets a little bit less positive, I would say, from the EU side. So on these classic indicators, no doubt, we are the dominant partner of the neighborhood. When we get to technology and knowledge exchange, we start to see really the competition coming from China. In the study, we have a big section on global value chains. I won't present it here, it's quite technical. But the point is, yes, trade integration between this region and the EU is very high. But what we economists call backward linkages, so where the inputs come from, China is growing very, very fast. And this is one example of it. These are high-tech imports from China as a share of the total. Light blue is 2007. China was not much of a player. Dark blue is 2021. And you see China is up to a third or even more in many countries. And if we had the EU on here, you would see, especially in some of the Eastern Partnership and Southern Neighborhood countries, China even starting to overtake the EU. So the dependence of many of these countries on China has grown enormously in the last decade and a half. And of course, that has negative implications from the EU side. There's lots more on the technology and knowledge exchange in the study. I can't present it all here, but the fields of action, what we propose are to, of course, invest in the EU's own technological competitiveness. Part of the reason why we're losing out to China in the neighborhood is a competitiveness question. It's not only that, there are other factors, but that's part of it. Integration of the digital markets, which is moving and is moving pretty fast, and that's very important, we think. Adapting and simplifying European patent law. Most companies in the neighborhood in the Western Balkans still patent in the US rather than in the EU. It would be very nice to change that. And then the last 2 points on technology and scientific cooperation and student exchange, and particular example of Erasmus+. These are areas where we are still very strong. These are areas within technology and knowledge exchange where the EU clearly has a lead on any of the rivals, but of course we have to make sure to maintain that. The fourth area we looked at is infrastructure, and here it's kind of a similar story to technology and knowledge exchange, where you see China arriving fast. If you look at the first part of the period, and here we zoom in on Southeast Europe, so Western Balkans and Turkey, 2007 to 14, so the first half of the period we looked at, and then 2015 to 21, Chinese infrastructure investment in Southeast Europe tripled. And there are countries where it has started to rival the EU, and it is causing a lot of problems. And anyone familiar with the case of Montenegro will know exactly what I mean by that. Of course, the EU is still the most important infrastructure investor in this region, but the growth of Chinese investment is serious. Now, We know now China's maybe pulling back from the Belt and Road. We know there's much more skepticism in the whole region towards China than there was even a few years ago. But just one interesting anecdote that maybe of how Chinese investment is changing. Last year, for the first time ever, Chinese FDI in Serbia was higher than EU FDI in Serbia, which is really a new thing and I think probably quite a concerning thing. Fields of action: improve the leveraging effect of public development financing. It's in our hands to do it. The EU has the means to do it. More to counter Chinese influence. Things are moving. Global Gateway, Build Back Better, but could be more. Green transition is very important. Transport is central. Some of you will know the EBRD annual reports on transport infrastructure investment needs specifically are generally 10 to 15% of GDP in this region, which is an enormous gap. It's way bigger than even Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, the least developed EU member states, and that's a gap that has been left and that China is partly filling. We have to acknowledge that. Again, making sure to fully crowd in private resources at this particular moment when investment flows are in flux, and creating the more incentives, and we're going to talk, I'm sure, a lot in the coming years about risk insurance schemes in Ukraine as an example, more incentive investments for EU companies in this region. The final section, I'm almost done with the overview, is then labor mobility, labor integration. EU has huge labor needs. We have huge labor shortages. We've had them for quite a while, and in many cases, they're getting worse. We have relied a lot on people from the neighborhood to fill these gaps, especially Ukrainians, actually, or even before the full-scale invasion. But the extent to which we can rely on immigration from most of the neighborhood in the future is going to be very limited. Already in the last decade, so up to 2020, the working age population, so that's the light blue bar, in most Eastern Partnership countries and most Western Balkan countries shrunk. And this decline is going to accelerate even more in the coming decades, so that's the dark blue bars. The only part of the neighborhood where we're going to see working age population growth as a whole in this decade and beyond is in the southern neighborhood. So to the extent that we can continue to rely on the neighborhood to fill our labor gaps, relatively it's going to be much more, it already is and will be much more about the southern neighborhood. Of course, we can hope to automate more. There are many other policies that we can do to solve these labor shortages. But ultimately, this is a huge constraint on economic growth in the EU. We are going to need millions of migrants still each decade into the future, and they're going to have to come relatively much more from the southern neighborhood than was the case in the past. So fields of action for labor mobility, balancing the needs of the EU, the neighborhood, the migrants themselves. We heard already a bit about that in the presentation at the start. Virtual labor mobility is interesting. We looked at that a lot in the study. People staying in the neighborhood but working for EU companies in the digital economy. Supporting circular migration, very important, so that the knowledge transfer also goes back into the neighborhood. Reducing brain waste, so making sure people who come here can work at appropriate skill levels, which we're not always very good at. And then focusing much more on the southern neighborhood, recognizing the particular importance now and in the future of the southern neighborhood. So that was it. There's really a lot in the study. I'm happy to discuss any details in the discussion round. Just briefly on the policy part at the end, we even have quite a long policy part, and of course, making any general policy statement for such a diverse range of countries is very difficult. So this is really big picture. But we use this formulation of carrots and sticks. Lots of people don't like it, but I think it makes the point clearly. On the one hand, more of an offering, bigger carrots, at least to the neighborhood countries where we see reform, progress reform, willingness and not making the mistake of North Macedonia a few years ago where that was happening, and they feel now very let down. So more access to the EU market, we've seen that happen with Ukraine already, and technical assistance to maximize the upside. More budget support, at least for the candidate countries that are willing to do what it takes to get the support, and more investment, especially in energy and the huge green potential. I hardly mentioned that. We also have that in the study, the big green potential of a lot of this region. Better private sector incentives to crowd in more financing, especially in this particular moment of nearshoring when lots of companies are thinking about investing nearer to home, nearer to the EU, the opportunity that gives for this region. Secondly, a tighter relationship, so a partnership approach on standard setting, on regulation, on foreign policy, sanctions that could maybe have been done better last year. Digital market integration, I already spoke about, and then student exchange, where we're already strong, but we have to also think, of course, about the future. The final point then is, with this bigger offering for the countries that really show the reform willingness and want to do what it takes to take advantage of these bigger carrots that we can offer, more conditionality, tougher conditionality on reforms, on standard setting, transparency, foreign policy alignment, trying to reignite, and I would say especially in the Western Balkans, a reform process which has gone off the rails in a lot of countries over the last decade, trying to get that back on track and bring the next group of countries into the EU. And then strengthening the euro as a reserve currency and using, or at least considering, using the euro a bit more in the way that the US uses the dollar to enforce what we want also in the neighborhood. So I leave it there for now. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Summarizing 100 pages in 20 minutes roughly, and the work of a big team, I would like to invite now the authors and the analysts from Elcano to come to the stage. Maybe we can do it as well in terms of mixing people from different institutions, different genders.
Gender part didn't work.
Yes, well. Of course, the China story, for someone that has worked quite a lot on China, is a big theme in this report, this study. Not surprising, but I think it makes us think in terms of how strategic we can be. Surprised as well that Egypt only exports 25% of its exports to the European Union. Maybe Haitham has something to say about that. I don't know. And I would summarize it that I think your overall recommendation is more carrots, but I guess at the end it points as well as at stronger sticks. True more carrots, and I don't know whether that would work or not. But just to start the conversation, I thought, given that in Madrid and in Spain we insist that we can not only look at the east, but we need to look at the south, I thought we would start with the south, and that we'll start with Haitham, and I'm sure Haitham has looked at the study and has reflected on the study, and so I would ask you to spend a few minutes reacting to the study, and then we have, if you want, Christian's reaction to your reaction, and then we move to the eastern part. We have then Mira's reaction or reflections on the study, and Miriam's response, and then we open it more to the overall themes of the study. But Haitham, why don't we start with you?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Miguel. It's great to be here today with all of you. Thanks to the Bertelsmann Stiftung and the great work that they've put together in this report. So I have very few minutes, and I'll focus on the southern neighborhood. The countries you just saw there, the 10 countries in the south and east of the Mediterranean. And since I only have a few minutes, I'm going to try to be as provocative and blunt as possible when I try to analyze the almost 20 years of European neighborhood policy towards the south. As it was mentioned, it was launched in 2004. The idea of creating a ring of friends was the term used at the time around Europe post-enlargement. If we look at our immediate neighborhood to the south, the one I work on, the question is, where were the ideals when the policy was launched and when there was a review of the policy? In a way, where were the words? And where are the realities and the facts on the ground of the neighborhood? And I have the feeling that the gap is very wide, and even at many levels getting bigger and bigger between the north and the south of the Mediterranean. When we talk about neighborhood, I understand that we all belong to the neighborhood. It's not only referring to those neighbors who live on the other side of the street. The neighborhood is the one that contains all of us. That's my understanding. So our neighborhood is not doing well That's my first point that I would like to raise. And I think if we compare the South today to how it was in 2004, many things have happened. Look at the old problems that existed in the region at the time. Almost all of them are still there, and the conflicts. On top of those conflicts and problems of socioeconomic order, of other type of orders, we've seen other layers of problems and conflicts add to the existing ones. So we have old and new problems that have not been solved, at least for large numbers and segments of societies in the South. If we look at 2011, the so-called Arab Spring, it was a turning point that did not materialize. At some point, many had the hope in the region and beyond that there was a possibility of having more dignified lives for people in their countries. It has not been the case, unfortunately. Not even for the only success story that we saw for some years where democratic transition started to take place, and that was Tunisia. It is no longer the case, at least for now. There is more regional fragmentation in the South. Yes, it was mentioned that this is more bilateral. It's the EU with each single neighbor, action plans, partnership priorities, etc. But there's no sense of a region. How can we have a neighborhood if each building is functioning independently from the other blocks that form the neighborhood? We see more trends of disintegration. Being in Spain, we have just to look across the Straits of Gibraltar to the southern Mediterranean, to the Maghreb region, North Africa, to see signs of disintegration in the sense of severing diplomatic relations, cutting cooperation, closing everything that can be closed, shutting down. This is not exactly how a region is built and consolidated. This is not how you bring your friends, if you consider them friends, maybe they're just business partners, together or closer to you. There is a rising and visible decoupling from the EU in the South. It's there. Figures are telling us. Presence of China, presence of Gulf countries, with their investments, with other actors, some of them new, others have come back, not only with investments, with resources, with their political preferences also. And all that, I think, poses a big challenge and actually kind of a paradox for Europe. The bloc that has worked a lot through different mechanisms to try to forge a neighborhood, the Barcelona process, 1995, that was quite a creative initiative. That really aimed at building a region for all inhabitants, for creating a free trade area. It was launched in 1995. The free trade area should have taken place in 2010. Unfortunately, we're far, far, far away from that point. So other countries are benefiting from what the EU has done in the region. China has benefited from a lot of what the EU has done when it comes to certain reforms, to all that's, the acquis communautaire, so basically the European, getting closer to European norms at some levels. Let me finish with 3 quick ideas. The reasons why this is the case, and almost 20 years after the European neighborhood policy was launched, the neighborhood in the South is not okay. I think the first reason is the lack of commitment, the lack of political will, and that goes on both sides, not only the EU. In the South, we have regimes that have been almost the same, so they have a long-term vision. The EU has long-term vision, but has also some limitations. Our policymakers have a different way of thinking. Our institutions also. The politics are very different. The second reason is the lack of imagination. At some point, the EU stopped thinking big when it was looking at the southern neighborhood. We forgot about the Euro-Mediterranean partnership, the Barcelona process. We tried with the European neighborhood policy to do something to replace what was not working, the Barcelona process. Then we added another layer, the Union for the Mediterranean in 2008, which many of us consider that, it's not a union, and it's not exactly working for the majority of the populations of the region. Most people don't even know that it exists and what its purpose is. The third reason, and here I have to be a bit harsh on the EU, it's the absurd competition between Europeans when dealing with the southern neighborhood. In many cases, single countries, individual countries, working each one on its own, in contradiction with the stated goals. This is important, the stated goals and the policies of the EU and its institutions. At some point, some European countries were even about to go to war in a certain southern Mediterranean country in a conflict scenario. So regimes in the south are very good at playing off one European government or leader against the other for whatever reasons, for investments, for trade, for other access to other privileges. This is self-hurting for the EU. This lack of vision, this strange competition is not good for the EU and its vision. The way in which it's done, competition, yes, there are ways that can be positive, but not this way, definitely not. And finally, we need to talk politics in the region. Yes, all these figures are very important. They explain a lot. They tell you trends. They can be used as arguments to persuade, but we need to talk politics. We need to talk about good governance. We need to look at a region that's growing in authoritarianism. That is exactly what the population in 2011 said, this is not how our problems are going to be solved. Well, the counter-revolution came in form of more authoritarianism, more brutal repression. And I totally agree with one of the conclusions of the report. The EU needs to think big, needs to offer big when dealing with the South. It's no longer like these small plans and documents that are rehashed and some of the buzzwords that are reused again and again. No, the EU needs to think big, needs to offer things that can be of interest, not only for the leaders of our neighbors, but also for their elites and middle classes. That's where elites, economic elites, middle classes can start realizing that, yes, maybe the context is there to try to push for changes in our countries, for reform. At the end of the day, this is what will provide stability. This is what will end hopelessness. The biggest threat that the EU faces in the South is not terrorism, is not refugees, migration. The biggest threat that the EU has in its southern neighborhood is hopelessness of a lot of people who are young. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks, Haitham. Christian, now you will tell us why the policy recommendations of the study will address all or some of the challenges that were just mentioned by Haitham.
I'm very happy to be here and to discuss Southern Neighborhood, Middle East, North Africa in Spain, because I would like to add a personal note. I participated in 1995 at the foundation of the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership in Barcelona, and it was an unbelievable huge civil society forum. I've never seen in the context of Europe and the Southern Neighborhood such a huge and vibrant civil society meeting than that was in 1995. We lost that momentum. We have the Anna Lindh Foundation, which is an important institution, but this big driving force of the civil society, we have to go back to this stage. And secondly, what Haitham said, and I'm really, really very much honored to be on a panel with Haitham, and you have here in Spain such an excellent expert for the Southern Mediterranean, Middle East, North Africa region. Haitham, I'm so happy to see you here again. Ala rasi. And the second one is the declaration of the Barcelona Agreement from 1995. When you read it, that all the leaders of the Southern Neighborhood have been signing their own name under democracy, rule of law, civil society, all these elements. We lost that, and we have to try to go back to that, to fill the gap, what Haitham said, with the hopelessness. And I will give or add 4 proposals, which are also built on the study. We've seen, as Richard presented, the importance of Turkey. Turkey has been driving away in the last years with Erdogan's way of authoritarian regime after he changed from a parliamentary system to a presidential system. But still we saw how strong the euro is and how strong trade relations are between Turkey and Europe and how strong FDI relations are. So I hope that European governments together have a joint action plan in their tables, that the day after the elections in Turkey, when there is a new government, that immediately we have a real good big stick, big carrot to offer to Turkey. I'm sorry, not the stick again. A big carrot. It depends on the outcome, yeah. But when yes, a more big stick when he stays in power. But then we really have to show our teeth. When you see how Turkey is, undermining the sanction system with Russia, how it's making Erdogan is making Turkey dependent on nuclear energy now on Russia. When you see this week that Putin and Erdogan have been symbolically opened a nuclear power plant in Turkey, which is 100% built or going to be built by Russia, and it's totally dependent in this way. Yeah, and how